Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight for this important conversation. We're very happy to have Ted Larson Freeman as a speaker to give us a better understanding of climate policy. Ted has been an active member of Citizens Climate Lobby on Bainbridge Island for several years. He has been in many meetings with our legislators to convince them to pass strong climate legislation. He has a clear understanding of the science of climate change, as well as the policies which have been proposed to deal with it. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us tonight, Ted. So why don't you, do you need to share your screen?
Yes, I'll do that.
Okay.
Right there.
Very good.
Are you seeing it? Okay. Except that I've got the wrong one. Okay. You should see a slide that says legislative overview of climate provisions.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Marty. And it's really nice to meet the rest of you. As Marty said, I've been involved with Citizens Climate Lobby, a group that I'll talk a little bit about here in the beginning for about 3 years now. And I've been a co-leader along with two others of the Bainbridge Island chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And so tonight I'm going to give you sort of an overview of where this is going to be kind of a more realistic talk than I often give. I'm talking in sort of more theoretical terms about what we might do. This is really about what is currently happening. So let's just go ahead and get into it. So I already kind of introduced myself. As I said, I live on Bainbridge Island. I've lived here for on the island about 20 years. Before that was in Seattle. Married, have 2 college-age kids, and look forward to a future for those kids that is better than the one we currently look like we are scheduled to hand them. So that's why I'm involved in Citizens Climate Lobby. We're going to have 3 main topics tonight. First, there'll be an introduction to Citizens Climate Lobby to let you know, I'll know a little bit about the organization. Then I'll shift into the main part of the talk where I'll give you an update on climate policy with a focus on the reconciliation process, what may come out of that, and the bipartisan infrastructure package, which has already been signed into law. And then we'll tackle the big question of how much will these packages, these bills really do to solve the climate crisis? So first, what and who is Citizens Climate Lobby? It's a nationwide, nonprofit, nonpartisan, grassroots advocacy organization. Each one of those terms is very important. In fact, it's more than nationwide now, it's actually international, but started in the United States and mostly is still in the United States. It's focused on national policies to address climate change. So we don't really work yet with state legislation. It's mostly working with our members of Congress and writing and contacting the White House to try to get national policies passed. And this is for the purpose of creating the political will for a sustainable world. We work toward building relationships with every member of Congress, no matter what their party is. That's why the nonpartisan is there. It's very important. It turns out that we still, as an organization, have difficulty retaining conservatives. It's mostly liberals who are involved, but the entire point is to build bipartisan will. That is, try to work with both sides of the aisle to get progress done. And it has about 590 chapters. And this little animation, I'm not sure how well it's coming across, but if you can see it, you can sort of see the growth over the years as Citizens Climate Lobby started with in about the year 2008 or 9 with just a few chapters. Let me see if I can run that again. Just a few small chapters, including up here actually, but it's grown very, very rapidly, especially just in the last couple of years. And now we have over 200,000 supporters all across the world, mostly in the United States, but around the world. And you are encouraged to connect with us, to engage into your own community if you would like. So the way we work is with 5 levers of political will. We lobby Congress is the first thing we do. Every November, we meet with Congress, members of Congress, try to set up meetings with every single member of Congress, and that has been pretty successful. We are organized by congressional district, so we try to meet with our own representatives. Up until the pandemic, those meetings would be in Washington, D.C., but now we've just been holding them virtually for the last 2 years. The second lever is media relations. CCL volunteers write a lot of letters to the editor and publish op-eds, hundreds of them, in fact, every year. We work with grassroots outreach, giving talks such as this that I'm giving to you tonight, and many other opportunities whenever we have a chance to speak at community groups. We try to do that. Grass tops engagement. This is kind of a funny word. When I joined the organization, didn't know what that meant. But what CCL means by grass tops is that they look to build relationships with sort of influential local people. So community business leaders, local political leaders, to try to get their support. And we try to list their support on the web pages that we put up in support of the bills that we advocate for. And the last one is group development. If any of you join a local chapter, then you would get all kinds of training. There's a wonderful training that's available online for each of the other 4 levers. So you can really learn to be an effective volunteer. Okay, so let's move on to the bipartisan infrastructure package and look at what is in this. Well, so in June, so this is a little bit of a just background here. So in June, there were key senators on both sides of the aisle and the White House, and they reached a framework agreement on what a bipartisan infrastructure package would look like. That resulted in compromised legislation that is about $1 trillion in new spending. 550 billion of that is in entirely new programs, and the rest of it is in just continuing to fund existing programs. The Senate passed this bill in early August, and the House passed it on November 5th. President Biden signed it into law as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's now the official name of it, on November 15th. And so for what is in this bill, the climate provisions that are in it are actually pretty extensive. There's about $47 billion that goes toward resiliency, and this includes flood and wildlife mitigation, ecosystem restoration, weatherization, and cybersecurity efforts. There's about $7.5 billion for clean school buses and ferries. It's $5 billion for clean school buses. So this is funding for school districts to replace existing buses with electric or zero emission buses, and $2.5 billion for converting ferries. I don't know how much of that may come to the Washington State ferries, but probably some. There is $7.5 billion for electric vehicle infrastructure. This is for charging stations. And there's a particular emphasis here on building those stations, building a network of stations that would include hard to reach rural communities, so that we would have a truly national infrastructure supporting electric vehicles. There's also $65 billion that goes into modernizing the electric grid. And there's actually going to be a new grid deployment authority, and that will be distributing that money. It's going to build thousands of miles of new resilient facilities for the expansion of renewable energy. This is like the biggest investment in our electric grid in American history. And remember, this has already been signed into law. There is also $21 billion for addressing legacy pollution. So this is going into cleaning up Superfund sites, reclaiming abandoned mines, plugging orphan oil and gas wells, that sort of thing. So CCL got to, these slides, by the way, I've pulled them from 3 or 4 different talks from the CCL's website. And so this slide was from a presentation that was sort of internal. So it was a bit kind of bragging about what CCL was able to do. But there are two big provisions that were included in the infrastructure bill that CCL had really lobbied extensively for. The first is the Hope for Homes Act. And this is a package that this was sort of, this kind of came out of early in the pandemic when people noticed that the home energy efficiency businesses in the US, which were just starting to come into their own, were really hit hard by the pandemic. It's very difficult to, as contractors, to get into people's homes during the pandemic. So this will provide support for them. It'll provide online training. It provides rebates for homeowners so that they can make the investments in energy efficiency improvements in their homes, and also auditing for big commercial and even residential buildings so that people know what kind of energy improvements they could make. And the second is the SCALE Act. The SCALE Act is this is really funding for trying to get carbon capture and sequestration off the ground. There's kind of a chicken and egg problem with carbon capture and sequestration, where you might not start a project if you're, say, a big industrial facility to capture CO2 because you have nowhere to pump it or send it. And likewise, nobody will come and build the pipes to take it and put it underground if no one is building the capturing facilities to begin with. So this sort of helps to kickstart that, get around that chicken and egg problem, and get us really going with carbon sequestration. So as a recap of this Infrastructure and Jobs Act, this accomplishes one of President Biden's domestic priorities, infrastructure. It provides $550 billion in new spending for infrastructure, including many provisions to address climate mitigation and resiliency. It includes provisions from two of CCL's previous supporting asks. That's, again, a little CCL speak there. When we meet with members of Congress, we always have a primary ask, the main thing we want to ask them. And then when we have a receptive conversation, we move on to secondary asks. So those Hope for Homes Act and SCALE Act were secondary asks this year. This has been passed by both House and Senate, signed by President Biden. So it is now law. There is much to celebrate here, but it is not nearly on the scale that we need to address the climate crisis. So there is more needed. So we get on to the good stuff here in the budget reconciliation process. So as a little bit of background, I'm sure with League of Women Voters, all of you have been following the news very carefully and understand all this, but I'll just give a brief summary here that the reconciliation is a process by which Congress can enact legislation that's financial in nature. So if it has to do with taxes, spending, or the debt limit, things like that, with only a majority vote. So that means that you don't have to have this sort of super majority necessary to avoid the filibuster. And because of that, Democrats just working with each other, as long as they can get full agreement in the Senate and near full agreement in the House, may be able to pass something through this reconciliation process without any Republican support. In October, late October, the Biden administration released what it called its Build Back Better framework. So this was a blueprint of what the administration wanted to see in a reconciliation bill. The House passed its version, so this became known then as the Build Back Better Act. And that's its version of the reconciliation bill on November 19th. And its estimated cost is around $2.2 trillion. You may remember that the number reported for many months was $3.5 trillion. So it's been pared down somewhat. Now it is in the Senate. The Senate is really where the action is here. Whatever the Senate passes will most likely be passed by the House and signed by the president. So it's the Senate that holds all the cards right now, simply because of the very narrow margin that Democrats have in the Senate. This has all been, this very drawn out and complicated process, and we're not anywhere near done with it, but just a kind of summary of how we got to where we are. So what is let's start with the Biden administration's Build Back Better framework. They were first in publishing this in October. So what was in that framework? So it included $320 billion in clean energy credits. So these are tax credits for a number of different things. This includes 10-year expanded tax credits for utility scale and residential clean energy, for transmission and storage, clean passenger and commercial vehicles, and clean energy manufacturing. So a whole lot of tax credits there. There are $105 billion in resiliency investments. So this is for addressing extreme weather events like wildfires and droughts, things like that, legacy pollution, and also a civilian climate corps. So that would be something sort of like the civilian climate corps from the 1930s, or the existing AmeriCorps program, providing opportunities for young people to spend time working on climate projects. And lastly, it also provides $20 billion in clean energy procurement, which means that the federal government spends a lot of money, it buys a lot of vehicles, buys a lot of energy. So this would provide the federal government itself, for its own procurements, the ability to invest in clean energy technologies. Okay, so that's the Biden framework. Now, what was the action in the House, and what is currently going on in the Senate? So in the House, as I said, on November 19th, the House passed its version of the bill. It's very similar to the administration's framework. It expands a little bit on various frameworks that were in the Biden administration's framework, but it is otherwise very similar. In the Senate, well, we are continuing to hear from sort of some of the climate champions, notably people like Ron Wyden of Oregon, who's the head of the Senate Finance Committee, or Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who is also on that committee, that they are continuing to have negotiations on some major climate policies, notably things like a methane fee and a price on carbon. And I'll get to both of those later on. So the methane fee is in the House version, but a price on carbon was not in the House version. If it were to be included, it would be put in sort of at this stage where the Senate makes its version. Okay, so let's look in a little more detail at the House reconciliation bill. Since it has already been passed, we know what is in it, as opposed to the Senate, where everything is still hush-hush while the negotiations proceed. So the House version includes basically the same provision for clean energy tax credits as was in the Build Back Better framework, $320 billion in clean energy tax credits. There was a compromise on the structure of the tax credits. So the House wanted to expand existing tax credits, and the Senate wanted to scrap that and start over with sort of a more cohesive system that was technology neutral and just sort of had three categories. Those categories are clean electricity, clean transportation, and energy efficiency. But the House wasn't ready to do that yet. So we ended up with a compromise where instead there are going to be existing renewable energy tax credits that are going to be funded for 5 years. So these are more specific, solar, wind, and so on. And then after 5 years, there would be a transition to the tech neutral approach that the Senate wanted, that would just have these three categories. So, and I kind of go into some detail there just to give you a sense of how complex and historic this legislation is and how difficult it is to get all of these things worked out. There's another provision here which I've read is somewhat unlikely to be included in the Senate version, but there is a provision here that these credits are tied actually to what are called labor and domestic content requirements. And what that means is that, for example, how much, if it's some product like a car, what percentage of the parts in the car were produced domestically, and what percentage of the car was produced by unionized labor. So this is an incentive for both of those. And again, we don't know whether that will survive in the Senate. So looking again at the clean energy tax credits, the existing Production credits are in these areas. This first bullet point here, the wind, solar, geothermal, transmission, battery storage, dynamic glass. That means, glass that when an electric field is applied to it, can change its shade, biodiesel, energy efficiency. And then the new tax credits that are coming along would include other categories such as nuclear power, production of clean hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, and things like that aren't currently on the list. So there's also carbon capture and sequestration, so-called Section 45Q. The amounts of that are going to be extended and increased for direct air capture. And there's a creation of this new electric vehicle tax credit, which has maximum credit of $12,500. So again, this is something that in the House bill is dependent on domestic and labor content requirements. So you might, depending on which kind of car you get, you might not be able to get that full $12,500, depending on what comes out of the Senate. But if you are thinking about purchasing a car, it might be worth waiting to see what happens with this legislation. There are investments and incentives for clean energy technology, manufacturing, and supply chains. So this brings back a 30% tax credit for re-equipping green manufacturing facilities. It creates a up to 25% credit for semiconductor and manufacturing facilities, which are very energy intensive facilities. And it reinstates the Superfund tax on crude oil that is imported to help pay so that fossil fuel products actually help to pay for the spilling and the mess that they make sometimes. And there's also $5 billion for manufacturing supply chain resilience. So this is for things like cement and steel manufacturing. So those are investments to sort of solidify the supply chains in those areas. So the resilience investments are pretty significant. There's $6 billion that will go to existing programs for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that are there to protect coastal marine environments. There's also about $1.6 billion that will go to tribal and native Hawaiian climate resilience and adaptation, including things like roads, public safety and justice programs, and so on, throughout Native American reservations and in other Native communities. There's $50 million for regional science centers that would explain all of this. There's $2 billion for improving energy efficiency or water efficiency or climate resilience in affordable housing. There's another $2 billion for rural rental housing. It's hard for renters to really do as much with their housing situations as homeowners. So this helps to make that easier for them. And there's a big strengthening for the National Flood Insurance Program. First of all, it would forgive over $20 million in debt, but also direct $600 million into new flood mapping and another $600 million into FEMA for their efforts on flooding response. There are also a lot of rural and agricultural investments, expanding existing conservation programs, over $20 billion. The Department of Agriculture will get money for research. There'll be rural electric cooperatives that are given grants and funding to help them to convert to clean energy. Forestry restoration and conservation programs will get a big boost, $40 billion there. And for National Resources Conservation Service, another $50 billion. There are also environmental justice provisions. There are clean energy taxes that have sort of an additional 10 or 20% bonus if they are located in low-income communities or in Indian land. And I'm not sure the exact difference between the 10% and the 20%, but there's also can be up to 20% for if it's with low-income residential buildings or has some other economic benefit. There's a Civilian Climate Corps, which gets around $4 billion for employment and training activities, and another almost $7 billion for national service programs. And this also includes what is known as the Justice 40 initiative. It requires 40% of investments to be in that are in low and zero emissions technologies to benefit low income and disadvantaged communities. And there is $9 billion for installing zero emissions technology and infrastructure in low income and disadvantaged communities. So that's a big plug for environmental justice programs. So to recap, this is a $2.2 trillion bill, and it includes about $550 billion in climate-related funding, clean energy tax credits, investments in manufacturing and supply chains, resilience, rural and agricultural investments, and it includes environmental justice provisions. So now let's turn to a couple of other provisions. First is the methane fee. This is included in the House bill. Methane, as you know, is a very potent greenhouse gas. It got a lot of attention at COP26 and in Scotland earlier this fall, and that's probably part of the reason that it is included here. So what's in this methane fee? It's not just a fee. There's also loans and grants and so on. So these maybe somewhat controversially would go to methane providers. So natural gas providers would have more funding to help them try to plug their leaks essentially. The fee is pretty steep. It begins at $900 per ton of emissions reported in 2023. So that would, in addition to those plugging the leaks, there also has to be some way to make measurements. So some of this will go into having infrastructure that will measure the leakage. That goes up to $1,200 per ton of excess methane by 2024 and keeps going up after that. So this fee is on the reported amount of methane that is emitted from production and non-production facilities, and that reach some specific percentage of the natural gas that is sold. So if you're selling natural gas, you are going to have to be looking at your business in a new way here. Get those leaks plugged. So that is, again, that was in the House bill. We don't know for sure if it will make it in the Senate. Joe Manchin has voiced some skepticism, some concerns, so we're not entirely, but he hasn't said no. So that's the current status. There was also something called the Clean Energy Performance Program, the CEPP. This is not in the Biden administration's framework or in the House bill. It would have provided $150 billion in grants that would have given money as an incentive to utilities if they increased their clean electricity by a rate of 4% every year. And it would have fined them if they did not make that 4% every year. So this was a big part of the package initially. It did pass out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee in September, but in October, Joe Manchin, Senator of West Virginia, announced he would not support this in any version, and it was dropped at that point. So when that was dropped, that left a big gap in the climate provisions here. So we'll get to that in a minute. So what is the action that we're seeing in the Senate? Well, in September, they announced they'd reached an agreement on the framework and that they began in the Senate to draft their proposals. They are working toward a final product, but we now expect this to go into January. So what are the implications for carbon pricing and CCL? CCL is a big proponent of carbon pricing. I'm going to skip most of just go to the last two things here. The second to the last one here is that there is a commitment that President Biden made when he campaigned to reduce emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030. That's a big goal. We want to get to that 50%. And Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, he was quoted maybe a month ago or so saying that there are 49 out of 50 votes, meaning of Democrats in the Senate, for a carbon price. So, and this, we know for sure, we've been assured that if it passes out of the Senate, it would be agreed to by the House, and the President will sign it. So that is some progress on the idea of a carbon price, which I'll explain in a little more detail coming up here. So CCL, again, this is again from an internal presentation, but CCL really celebrated this success. We had a very big campaign to get our supporters to call members of Congress and the president over the last, say, 6 months, and we got over 168,000 contacts if you include phone calls and email that went out in support of all that. We saw movement on among people who previously had really not engaged that much with the idea of carbon pricing. And we had a lot more support than we kind of expected. So that was a really big deal. And we got also our secondary asks into the infrastructure bill. So we're making good progress. I really think CCL kind of found its voice in the last 6 months in having an influence on both of these pieces of legislation. Okay, but now let's turn to the big question. Will this really get the job done? We face a really quite enormous crisis ahead of us if we don't take very strong action. I'm going to kind of skip over some of this. Yes, skip over this a little bit. This is all just to mention some terminology and to say that what I'm about to show you relies on these 7 different simulations. These are simulators they're sort of coupled simulators of the economy, the energy delivery system, and the climate system. And they all sort of feed into one another. They're all coupled together. And each of those 7 does it in a slightly different way. So to get a sense of what the economics and what the science tells us, we want to look at all of these together. And doing that, let me just go a couple of things. Okay, so here we have a graph showing our the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted by the United States from 2005 up to the present. You see it's been sort of a little bit of a jagged line, but it's pretty much a nice straight downward trend, which is a nice thing. That's because we are already advancing toward already adopting clean energy. When they talk about a 50% reduction, that's relative to 2005 levels, and we're already about 20% below that. So in order to meet the US Paris Agreement, we need to reach that bottom dotted line there, 50% below 2005 levels. So we're now about 20%, so that's good. But in order to get to 50%, we have to be on that dotted line. And you'll notice that dotted line is about, roughly twice as steep as the line that we've been on. So it is going to require big changes. So now, well, I'm just going to do this kind of fast here. I'm not going to explain the difference between these models, but all those models that I mentioned before pretty much show us that if we followed business as usual, that is, if we didn't do any of these pieces of legislation, we would end up in 2030 about where we are now, maybe between a range of 17 to 25% below 2005 levels. So we would certainly not have reached the goal, anywhere near the goal of 50% reduction. Now, so there's an average, and I won't say anything about that, but just to show you here, this next green line that was just added shows you that where we would be in the year 2030 if we get the Build Back Better bill passed in the form that we currently understand it, basically, and it includes the methane fee. Then by the year 2030, we would be at around 40% reduction. So that's very good. 40% reduction is huge, but it's not quite what we need in order to meet the Paris Agreement or to really be on schedule toward having a livable world. So now just kind of going through these, we are now 20% below. By January 2023 is when realistically these policies would go into effect. And with no action at all, will be not much different by the year 2022 or 2030. We need to be 50% below. So how do we fill that gap? All right. So to fill that gap, and again, this gap partly exists because of the fact that the clean energy program died that I mentioned before, that didn't get support. Well, the answer that CCL has for how we fill this last gap, what is the policy that's missing here, is a price on carbon. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the main proposal that CCL advocates. It's known as the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. This has been introduced in the House of Representatives each of the last 3 Congresses. In this Congress, it's bill number 2307. And these slides are from sort of the official CCL deck on this act itself. The way it works is that there would be a fee that is charged on fuel sources at the source. That means at the mine or the well or the port. It's a rising fee. It starts out at $15 a ton, but goes up at $10 per ton every year. So it ratchets up very quickly. All of the money, minus maybe about a 2% administrative fee, would come back to American citizens as a dividend. So what would happen is you would get money. The first year, you might get about $24 a month deposited into your bank at the start of the month. And then you'll notice all your prices are a little bit higher as you go through your shopping. And you'll kind of know, oh yeah, but I got that money at the beginning of the month. Okay, but you might, maybe make no changes at first, but eventually you start to find ways to save some of that money for yourself by making slightly different purchases. And when you do that, you would be making purchases that help to reduce carbon footprint without even knowing it. At the moment, if you try to do that, it's a huge amount of research for even the most committed climate advocate. But if you start to make this change for every single person making every single transaction in the economy start to take this into effect, then it has an enormous impact in the aggregate. There's another part of this, which is there's a carbon border adjustment. Because costs now would go up for US manufacturers, they would be given a rebate when they export, and there would be a tariff applied that's equal to the fee on goods coming in from any country that does not have a similar fee. So that keeps it a level playing field for American businesses, and hopefully would provide incentive for other countries to adopt a similar policy so that those border fees would not go into US government coffers, but would go to their own governments. So that should be a strong incentive. As a nice twist here, this is something CCL has been advocating for years, and now it looks like Europe is actually going to impose a border carbon adjustment before we do. So hopefully that will stimulate us to actually adopt this type of economic approach as well. But that's the central idea. This one approach, if designed right, would get us to net zero by 2050. It would give us affordable clean energy. It would save lives by reducing pollution, and it would put money in your pocket. Just to drive that point home a little bit, it does depend on your economic situation. So here what I've showed is if we break up the US population into 5 quintiles, that is groups of 20% by household income. So quintile 1, that's the lowest 20% of people by household income. The next quintile 2 is the next 20%, and so on. Okay, now the green number is the amount of money you would be expecting to get from the dividend. And this is a taxed benefit, which means that people at lower incomes would get more than people at higher incomes. So if you look here, quintile 1 is getting more money than quintile 5, even though it's the same, it's initially the same amount of money, but because it's taxed, you're going to get more if you're in the quintile 1. And so on an annual basis, it might add up to around $514 for people in quintile 1. And that slowly goes down to $383 for people in quintile 5. Meanwhile, if we look at energy costs that people have, your costs are all going to go up. But if you think about it, people if we're all getting basically the same amount of money, the people at the lower end of the spectrum, who don't live in big fancy houses, they don't drive cars, they don't big cars all over the place, they don't take a lot of European vacations, they just have a much lower carbon footprint to begin with. So that means they're spending less money to begin with. If you have less money, you're spending less money. And that means that you are going to put out less than you get. So people in that lowest quintile, you see, they are getting almost twice as much money, 514 compared to 273, then they'll have to pay. And that gets a little bit, narrower, but by the time you get to quintile 3, it's still more money. So that means that 60% of people, without even making any changes in their lifestyle, would get more money from this policy than they have to pay. And of course, they would have the same incentives as everyone else to try to keep some of that money by making slightly different purchasing choices. So in this way, it's actually a progressive policy because it's just sort of designed that way through the economics. Now, this policy here is not well, I should say, yeah, let me just pause here. This policy is not what the Senate is going to adopt if they adopt a carbon pricing policy. They will adopt something very similar, though. They will probably do something like, say, put in a means test so that people, say, in quintile 5 get none of this money, or maybe a reduced amount. Maybe even quintile 4, I'm not sure. We don't know exactly. But the temptation, of course, is very strong to take some of the money and use it for some of those other climate provisions. And so that is very likely to happen. So it's not quite this, what is happening in the Senate. There are about 5 or 6 similar proposals that have been floated around, notably one by Senator Whitehouse and one by Senator Durbin. Those are probably closer to what would actually be adopted. What I'm showing you here is a pure economic policy that doesn't take the money to do anything else. It just gives all the money back to Americans. But we will probably get something that's more of a hybrid. And just to drive home the point on effectiveness, I'm just going to go through just very quickly to the end here. Okay, so I'm not going to, please don't try to read this. I'm just going to make the point that you'll see the green line is what we expect would happen if we had that economic policy, that carbon tax, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And this comes out of running those models that we looked at before. And you'll notice it gets us on the line that we need to be on in order to meet 50% reduction by the year 2030. That's this little blue diamond there at the year 2030. And we should, if it continued, get all the way to 100% by the year 2050. And and if I get back to where I was, and if you notice, the clean electricity payment program in the sort of the reddish line there above is not quite as good. And the reason for that is that really only affects the power generation sector of the economy, whereas something like the carbon tax affects every single transaction that occurs throughout the entire economy. And that's why it's more effective. So this is why CCL advocates for this. This is why we are still hopeful that some version of a carbon tax will be included in reconciliation. And hopefully that will make us make up that gap between the 40% reduction that we would get with the current plan, if it includes a methane fee, and where we need to get. So that is all I had for today. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll stop sharing and say any questions.
Thank you very much, Ted. That was wonderful. And I learned a lot, and boy, you covered a lot. So anyone have any questions? Margie?
Yeah, how do our local legislators feel about the carbon tax proposal?
Yeah, so Derek Kilmer in the 6th District is a co-sponsor of the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and we now have 2 new co-sponsors in our state just in the last few months. Pramila Jayapal of Seattle, she came on board, and just in the last few weeks, Adam Smith. So we now have 3 out of our 10 members and 3 out of our 7 Democratic members now are our co-sponsors. There are 92 co-sponsors of this bill in the House of Representatives. That's a huge fraction of the Democratic coalition. So it is an idea that's gaining currency. It has, however, been difficult to get the exact same bill introduced in the Senate. The last couple of years. So initially, when it was first introduced, there was a version introduced in the Senate, but since then we've run into difficulty with that, probably because there are senators who have sort of a slightly different idea. So the White House idea, the Durbin idea, these are a little bit different ideas. They see this as also kind of a source of income, right? We could use that money for some of these other things, and that's pretty attractive. So that's probably why this bill didn't get support in the Senate in the last Congress. As I said, we probably should expect, if something like this comes out of the Senate version, it will probably be closer to the Durbin or the White House approach than this approach here. But we'll take what we can get at this point. And if they pass something, we will probably work on improving it over time, because that's the other thing about it is the how high the amount is that's charged initially and how steeply it goes up, that might be kind of reduced, and so it would be less effective. So we probably will have to continue to lobby for strengthening it as over time as we go forward.
Anita?
You had mentioned in one of the last graphs about how when people get dividends that come back to them, how they will be investing more in a green footprint. How does that work? How do you know that will do that?
Well, see, because the price of everything that you buy would then include, would have sort of baked into it the cost of the carbon that went into it. So if you imagine, just imagine anything I see behind you a bookshelf, right? So when you bought that bookshelf, what went into that production? Well, there's some company somewhere is buying, raw materials that get shipped to it. There's pieces of metal, they're buying screws, they're paying people to put them together. They're having to heat their factory. They're paying for shipping to ship it out to you. Every single step along the way of production of that bookshelf involves transportation, involves extraction of raw materials, manipulating those raw materials. All of that involves energy. And so if you start to put a cost on all of that, that's going to add up, and that bookshelf is going to cost you more. So now you're going to go into the store next time you need a bookshelf and be like, oh, I was thinking of buying this bookshelf, but look over here, here's this other bookshelf. It looks pretty good. I didn't know about this company, but it's a little bit cheaper. Well, maybe I'll try this one instead. And without even knowing it, you've just bought something that used less of a carbon footprint. That's the beauty of it, is that it's not just you, the people who are on this call. This is everyone making every financial decision that they make. So you don't have to know anything about the climate. You are already running a little calculator in your head every time you make a purchase about what you buy. Now, if all of a sudden the amount of money that you spend is related to the footprint, then it starts to take you. Imagine it this way. Let's say we were to go put little flags on everything in the grocery store that's told you how much carbon went into production of each food item. And we told you at the beginning of the month, okay, here, you get a certain number of flags. Here, I'm going to hand this to you. Here's your 500 flags or whatever. And you go through the grocery store, and then you could choose things and count up your flags and make sure you didn't go over that amount. Okay. So that would be a way to get you to, have less of a carbon footprint. Well, what's simpler than that? Let's just use the flags we already have. Money. You already buying things in the store, making your decisions in part based on the cost. So if now the cost includes the amount of carbon that went into it, then you start to, maybe you don't make changes right away, but as this ramps up and gets more and more expensive over the first few years, you find yourself kind of thinking, gee, if I just did something a little different, maybe I could save some money and keep some of that money for myself. And so then you've kept the money and you spent less on the carbon inefficient products. So by doing it this way, it's actually a very gentle way of doing it, because you're not requiring people to make some enormous change all at once. What you're doing is you're making them just sort of naturally make little small changes throughout their daily expenditures. And that's a very powerful force. It can move the entire economy. This is what's been advocated for many years by economists.
I have another question. Now that Joe Manchin's financial profile has been shown that he has investments in a coal mine, do you think that will help persuade him or embarrass him enough to make some changes just to save face?
I think there are so many people trying to read the tea leaves on every little statement that Joe Manchin makes these days. I don't know any more than you do. I would be delighted if that's the case. I don't know. He's a difficult one to predict, but one thing that is a source for optimism is he hasn't said no yet, right? He hasn't said yes to the carbon fee. He's voiced some concerns, is the way it's been put, on the methane fee. So I take that to mean that the methane fee is probably going to be at least weakened, if not outright tossed out. The carbon fee, though, he has said some fairly positive things like, well, if you use the money for research or, for protecting coal miners. And I mean, he has sort of seen some ways that he can support it. So, we haven't given up on him, and CCL has. Okay, so we made it very clear, don't call Senator Manchin if you are not from West Virginia. That does no good, okay? But what CCL has done is it's organized people to call its supporters who live in West Virginia. So if you happen to be a member of CCL and you live in West Virginia, I bet you've gotten a lot of phone calls recently. And we're asking those people to call Senator Manchin's office. And these calls are effective. I mean, Pramila Jayapal, when asked like what brought her around, because she knew about this bill for a long time, she said there was constituent phone calls asking her to support it made a big difference in her decision. CCL volunteers met with her and they showed her a list of other members of the Progressive Caucus who were already co-sponsors, and she really studied that list carefully. So, and that made an impression on her. So, politicians are influenced by a lot of things, but they are very influenced by the number of phone calls they get on a particular topic. They're influenced by their peers. And so these are all the levers that CCL tries to use in its advocacy. Ed.
Ed.
Good to see you, Ed. How are you doing? Yeah.
As usual, I loved your talk, Ted. You do such a wonderful job of breaking things down.
Oh, thank you so much. CCL makes it easy because I'm using their slides, right? So
it's still not easy.
Well, yeah.
So speaking of your slides, do you mind showing your last graph again?
Oh, sure.
Okay, I've got a question about that. And it kind of relates to Senator Manchin.
Sure. This one?
Yeah, so the Clean Electricity Payment Program, that is the CEPP that that Manchin quashed.
Yes.
So I'm fascinated by that in that, that was touted as such an important part of the whole package.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of despair after Manchin ditched it.
Yeah.
And what this graph is showing is that the carbon fee actually could do more.
Yes.
Than it could anyway, do more. Mm-hmm. And I'm surprised because I just haven't heard much press or talk about this as a real substitution. And,
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point here. So I think what happened was the history here is that so carbon price has, first of all, there was the aborted effort back in 2009 to get a cap and trade system in place, which was killed by energy companies coming in and lobbying against it. And so at that point, it became putting a price on carbon sort of got lumped in with cap and trade. And so a price on carbon was, for example, that in 2016, that was a big part of Bernie Sanders's proposal for dealing with climate, and it was not controversial on the left at that point. But in the years since then, it sort of acquired a negative view by many people on the left, who are like not wanting to saying, "Oh, this is kind of the wrong policy. It's just this, revenue neutral policy. We should really take that money and just spend it on the Green New Deal." And so it sort of fell out of favor on the left, and CCL has been like trying to keep kind of keep to the center and saying this is what we want, and try to build bridges on both sides. That's the goal here. So I think that as we came into the reconciliation process and the infrastructure process, at that point, people, especially on the left, have sort of lost interest in a carbon price, and that's where CEPP came in. It's like, okay, that seemed like a good idea. We make the energy companies pay. See, the fear on the left really comes from this. This is the hard thing to explain to people. it's really hard to, I mean, once you say where there's going to be, all your costs are going to go up, many people immediately become afraid, and they especially are concerned about low income people. How are low income people going to pay those fees? That's the question. So you have to really explain this in detail. You have to really slow down and explain this, how this works, how people at low incomes already have a low carbon footprint. So they're going to pay a lot less in the tax to begin with. And so they will end up doing better. That's a hard concept to get across.
Ted,
So, yeah.
could you just point out that those black numbers at the top of each column are the amount they will pay?
Right. Yeah. Let me say that again. So the green number is the amount of money you get. All right. So we start at the lowest. Do you guys see my mouse as I move it?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So you can see people at low income would be getting $500 a year, roughly. Again, this is the first year. It gets, the amount goes up each year, but it goes down as you get to the higher incomes, $455 to $421. The quintile 3, we're talking about the median household income in the United States is $62,000, or at least it was in 2019 when I did a previous talk. So here we're talking, right here, we're talking in household incomes, just to kind of peg it where that is, around $62,000. So people in that income and below are all going to get more money than they have to pay. This number here, the 273, is your increased cost. And it's, it's divided up in this graph into direct energy costs and financial asset costs, indirect costs. We can go into that in more detail, but the point is, in general, people at low incomes are just spending less money. And so they're not going to have as much of a tax. So they're going to get $514 and have to pay $273. They come out way ahead. This, by the way, that quintile, the average income, is something really shockingly low. I'm trying to remember the number. It's we're talking people in poverty or in this category. But even in these two quintiles, where people are doing a little bit better, it's, oh, sorry, I moved my mouse. Yeah, so yes, that is, that's how this works. This works because people at low incomes have low carbon footprints. By the time you get up to these people, so this is in this quintile, we're talking like $220,000 income is a typical, sort of the mid-range in this quintile. Well, those people, they can afford a little bit of a tax, right? So they're going to have to pay $921 and they're only going to get $383. Oops. Well, that's a very small percentage of the income for somebody for a family whose income is $220,000 a year, right? They can afford that. Even here in the fourth quintile, it's still not very much they have to pay. So when you spread it out across everyone, for 300 million people in the United States, the costs are a lot lower. So I'm not sure yet if I really answered your question, but I'm sort of thinking about it, how I've watched it develop, right? It's been sort of a question of what policies were popular with different political groups. As far as why it hasn't been really gotten that much press, we're starting to see it getting more press. So the New York Times had a big article on it at the time that the CEPP sort of died. There is definitely some movement, but it also is difficult to get across the idea of, so CCL doesn't call it a tax. They like to call it a fee and dividend. You get the money. Well, and so you're starting to see people talk about it as a cash back, because dividend, it kind of sounds like people who own stocks get dividends. What is this dividend you're talking about? So they're still kind of working on the right messaging for it, and maybe to call it cash back or carbon cash back, something like that will be a better way to explain it. You're going to get some money. That's the main point. So as these efforts go along, as it starts to become more realistic, CCL actually wants right now to fly a little bit under the radar. Don't really want that much press on it right now, because this is such a delicate time of negotiation in the Senate. And if we do get it into the reconciliation package at this point, then there's going to be an explosion of opposition by some people. And so we'd like it to get in there first before that happens, so that we can then, then sort of actually get the progress that is needed before we have to really explain it and deal with that opposition.
I hadn't actually gotten to my questions yet.
Oh,
but
sorry.
I imagine your time is limited and you
No,
have a couple of other people that want to ask questions. So
I'm
gonna
happy to ask questions. Do you want me to bring the graph back up?
No.
Oh, okay.
But I also want to give the discretion to Marty or whoever is taking charge of the session as to whether to just go on to the next people.
Well, I see, Margie, do you have your hand up?
I do. One was, and maybe these are quick, maybe they're not, and I can defer to Ed, I think it is, too. But as far as the amount each quintile would get, am I understanding correctly? It isn't like the government would send less to the quintile 5 people.
No, they would.
Everybody about 500, but the higher quintiles pay taxes on it.
Yeah. Well, the tax would actually be sort of just like your paycheck. You have taxes deducted when you get paid. It would be like that. So the people in the higher quintiles would actually get a little bit less, and then there would be a W-2 that you would get that you would use with your taxes at the end, just like any other job situation. But yes, every month they would be getting a little bit less money deposited in their bank than the lower income people.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was on that graph was why the CEPP levels out. Is that because well, I'll let you just answer it. So
that's complicated, and I have a whole tool I could kind of explain this a little bit, but there comes a point where many of these policies sort of reach saturation. They reach their effectiveness, and so you're paying people to produce utilities to adopt 4% more renewable power every year. Well, there comes a point where that just becomes pretty difficult for them, right? Mm-hmm. And so it becomes something that is it's especially expensive when you get above 80%. When you get above 80% of renewable of a mix of renewable energy in your system, the problem with those sources, wind and solar especially, is that they're intermittent. So you can't turn those on and off at will, which you can with like a gas-fired power plant, right? So that's where, say, nuclear power would be a great alternative if we can get advanced nuclear power working well, for example. But with renewables, it becomes pretty hard to go. There's other things like we're working on battery storage. We're working on clean hydrogen, where you use excess from your excess capacity in your renewables to produce a hydrogen, which is then stored fuel that gets used later. Hydrogen isn't a renewable energy source; it's a conveyance. It allows you to store energy in a form that then can be used, say, in long haul trucking or something. So that's what these are some of the ideas for how you can still work with renewables even above the 80% capacity. But that's part of the reason is that you start to reach that saturation for that policy. Because But there's a great tool that I'll just mention called En-ROADS. That allows you to simulate this. I have a whole other separate talk on that. Happy to give some other day. It shows how to use that tool where you can kind of see how these policies work over time and how they, some of them, kind of run out of fuel eventually. And that's why, frankly, you need a mix of policies. You can't just do everything with just one policy.
Are there maybe this is a naive question, but in the Senate, are there any Republicans at all that might have a chance of being willing to be on board with this?
So yes and no. There are not in the reconciliation process. There's no chance of any Republican support for the reconciliation process, because I just talked about climate, but if you think about it, the reconciliation involves, family leave and many other democratic priorities are all being put into this one package, right? And those other provisions, there is zero Republican support for any of that. So even there are a few senators like Mitt Romney, even surprisingly, like Lindsey Graham has voiced support for carbon fee and dividend before. I've seen it on video, So you might get some Republicans who supported it as a standalone bill, but you're not going to get any of them to support it as part of the reconciliation.
Ed, do you want to go ahead and finish your question? I think I interrupted your question.
It's okay. If it's okay, yeah, I'll just say them. And one had to do with whether you have a sense of increasing support for the carbon fee and dividend since the CEPP went down, and given that this may be the only other way to get to where we want to go, particularly among climate activists and climate organizations. So I'm just kind of wondering if,
I think that's very, I'm sure that's a lot of what happened. I think if the CEPP were still in there, I don't think we'd be talking about a carbon price, or if we were, it would be like a small thing added on, right? Maybe. But if people had gotten enough out of the CEPP, if they thought they were getting enough out of it, so that would mean everything else that I talked about, including the methane fee and the CEPP, that would be pretty good, right? That would be getting us probably pretty close to that 50%. Then probably we would not be talking about a carbon price at all. So the fact that died meant, okay, for people who didn't like it, it's like, okay, we got to look around for a plan B. What's our plan B? Okay, I've been ignoring Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm a progressive. I don't like that, but okay, what is it? What do you got? So it's the last quiver in the last bow in the quiver. Yeah,
that's okay. The other question related to environmental justice in an unusual sense, I think, and that is that I'm on the Olympic Peninsula, a rural area. And one of the aspects of environmental justice that sometimes gets ignored, although I noticed in some of your slides, there was some particular emphasis on rural areas. But in terms of the fee and dividend, I see a niche within the lower income group of people who particularly have to drive a lot. And so I'm just wondering, is there any kind of environmental justice provision that tries to compensate for the unintended consequences in some cases? And part of the reason I'm wondering is just, in terms of political support across the country, I am interested that Kilmer has co-signed, and it'd be interesting to hear what he says. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So first I should mention that it looks like gasoline will be exempted. Whatever they're considering, we've heard that gasoline will be exempted. And that's among CCL people, when we first heard that, it was like, wait, no, we need it for everything. But in fact, some of the modeling that's been done shows that that's only just maybe a few percent. So it's okay. We can give up that few percent in benefit for the political benefit of not raising people's gas prices, because that's a really politically sensitive price, maybe more than almost anything else. Maybe your heating bill goes up more than your gas bill, but you really feel the gas bill more, psychologically when you go to pay for it. So that's the first thing that's going on, is that probably will be exempted straight off. As far as how to deal with so that one thing that's a little bit misleading in the graph I showed, people getting more money at lower incomes and so on, is that's an average, right? So you are going to have people in every one of those groups that are in a little bit different situation. And what you're talking about is exactly one of those situations. People with low income, but they live someplace where they spend a lot on transportation. So I think the best way that CCL can support having environmental justice address those people is to support some of the other policies that I talked about today, not to fiddle with the carbon fee and dividend, to leave that as it is, as a relatively simple policy, but to support some of these other things that are for environmental justice. That's kind of my answer for the way I think about what CCL should advocate. There's a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that the whole carbon fee and dividend program if it's successful, it has an arc. It grows for the first 10 years, then it comes down for the next 10 years. So if what you're asking people to spend and what you're giving them go up together, down together, that's a fairly easy policy to put in place and just let it run. Whereas if you put something in place where you take the money and use it for other stuff, but you're going to provide assistance to make it up for low income people, then you have to keep tabs on that, and you have to keep ratcheting that up and ratcheting it back down again at the same time, instead of it happening just automatically. And then it becomes harder, and it becomes something that maybe gets neglected and because of some political battle or some election result. So these are the reasons why having a pure economic approach is just simpler and more robust in the long run. Yeah, Anita.
I just read a study showing that people's in the United States, our empathy level has gone way down since 1979 and another one in 1989. How are you going to sell this package when you see that people in the $220,000 income bracket having to pay more? You know, that I see instant resistance.
Right. Okay. So the question is, will the resistance of the top 20% be hard to overcome? Because those people have more political influence, right? It's not, let's be honest about that. So that's hard to say. So it partly depends on how, so this is another reason that CCL adopts a very sort of neutral policy. It's like it's a tax policy. So we just give everyone the same amount of money, but it's taxed. And then what's nice about that is then, because we renegotiate our tax policy with every election, right? When Barack Obama was reelected in 2012, one of his campaign talking points was, oh, we'll ask the top 1 or 2% to pay more, right? And then after the election, he got into negotiations with the Republicans in Congress, and then they compromised on it. Well, so that's an example, but that happens almost every presidential election. And so if you put a policy in place that just sort of is using the tax policy generally, which is what the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act would do, then it will go up and down together along with those election results and along with the adjustments in our tax policy that we are already negotiating all the time. So that's one reason I like it. And I think it looks like a fair policy. You're asking people at the top to pay a little bit more, but not more than they can afford. It's affordable. It's a few $100s a year or something like that, at most, to start with. It'll go up over time. But those people also are people with enormous economic resources. People in the top 20% can much more easily change what car they drive, can much more easily change what kind of house they live in, can much more easily change many aspects of their lifestyle. People at the lowest 20% have a very hard time making those kinds of adjustments. Once they're locked in to a place to live, what kind of car they buy, it's very hard to change those things. So I just don't see people at the top being that upset about it. It's a little bit of an increase in their taxes. They might grumble, they might vote differently, but I think it's a small risk we have to pay. We have to ask some people. We can't do this for free. Right? There's going to be a little bit of pain. And in my view, asking that top 20% to pay a little bit more of the pain is fine when you can point out to them, you have the bigger carbon footprint. All right. Yeah, you're paying more. But guess what? You don't have to pay more. You can go and choose a greener lifestyle. Nobody's stopping you. Please think about it. You can afford to put those solar panels on your rooftop. If nothing else, you can afford that fancy new electric car. You can afford to do things that really reduce your carbon footprint in a way that's very hard for people at the lower end of the spectrum. People at the lower end of the spectrum can maybe make little changes, but it's hard for them to make the big changes that are very easy for people at the top to make.
So can you use the word sacrifice at all with any effect?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't use that word. I would, if I'm talking to somebody at the top end of the income spectrum who's skeptical about it. I mean, okay, so I work in technology, right? I work for a big software company, so I know plenty of people in that top tier, and a lot of them are pretty progressive in their viewpoints,
Mhm.
especially where I happen to work. So they're okay with this kind of thing. If I encounter someone who doesn't like it just because of their own personal, just don't want change, or they afraid to they might pay a little bit more. It's not quite the way they want to do it. I don't see it rising to such a level of importance for them. A new provision that costs them a few $100s a year, it's not going to generate huge opposition. I just don't think so. It's not high enough, and because it ratchets up quickly, but it's kind of it goes into effect and people kind of get used to it. Then it goes up a little bit more the next year, a little bit more the year after that. As people get more and more used to it, it's not such a big change at one particular year. If you look at 10 years down the road, it's a big change compared to the first year, but they kind of have time to get used to it.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
that's the hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ted. I really appreciate you coming and sharing all this. We've got a lot to ponder. So kudos and thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. Next month, we'll be having Martin Gibbons from the League of Women Voters. I forgot to look up what his official title is, but he is on environment and energy sector, I believe. And he's going to talk about Washington State Legislature climate bills.
Well, let me just say thank you, Marty, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Ted.
right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Good
Marty.
night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.